Zambia has voted. Hakainde Hichilema has secured another term, and Brian Mundubile has discovered that winning several regions is unfortunately different from winning a country. Hichilema campaigned across every district, holding more than 100 rallies and collecting votes even where he lost, while Mundubile consolidated significant support in former PF strongholds. Then came the extraordinary election drama. Claims of an assassination attempt, a security operation, high-grade weapons arrests, and allegations of activity threatening national security. Tonight, Second Take examines Zambia's election, the competing stories surrounding Kabulonga, and why some international reporting seemed determined to understand Zambian politics without first understanding Zambia. My name is Ashwin Berry Buriwanji. Welcome to the show. Hakainde Hichilema did not treat Zambia like a regional family reunion where you greet your favorite cousins and quietly avoid everybody else. He treated the entire map as compulsory. More than 100 rallies, every district. Southern Province delivered the enormous numbers it has delivered before. Western and Northwestern followed, but the more interesting numbers came from places where Hichilema was weaker. He went there too. Sometimes the applause was softer and the opposition stronger, but he still collected votes. Elections are not won only by winning your favorite provinces spectacularly. Sometimes they are won by losing somewhere 55 to 45 instead of 70 to 30. You do not need everybody to love you. You simply need to remember that everybody gets a ballot. That is how 60% gets built. You visit the places where winning is easy, then visit the places where winning is unlikely. You drive, stop, speak, shake hands, and move again until the map runs out. It is not glamorous political science, it is mileage. And the ballot box remembers who arrived. Mundubile operated from a different foundation. His strongest ground sat inside political networks that once called themselves the Patriotic Front. These were not remnants of an obscure movement that once organized a successful raffle. The Patriotic Front governed Zambia for 10 years. Michael Sata took power in 2011. Edgar Lungu continued until 2021. Governments leave office, their networks are considerably less obedient. 10 years in government creates relationships, organizers, local structures, appointments, and regional loyalties. Mundubile came from that political world. He had served as a member of parliament and provincial minister while the Patriotic Front controlled the state. The National Reconciliation Party for Unity and Prosperity that carried him in 2026 drew heavily from those experienced Lungu-era networks. And those networks worked. Parts of the Northern Belt responded. Luapula responded for sure. Sections of the Copper Belt definitely responded. Those votes were real. They represented communities where memories of the previous political order remained strong, and where dissatisfaction with the current government created genuine space for Mundubile. Now, 38% of a presidential election is not nothing. Unfortunately, 38% is also not 60%. Mathematics remains stubbornly undemocratic about that. The problem was expansion. Southern Province disappeared from Mundubile's physical campaign schedule, with security concerns cited and a virtual rally offered instead. Western and Northwestern experienced blockages and confrontations. Those provinces are not decorative pieces on the Zambian map. They contain voters, quite a lot of them. And while one campaign struggled to establish physical presence there, Hichilema's campaign had already arrived with microphones, vehicles, promises, and the most useful piece of political technology ever invented: the candidate. Apparently, voters still enjoy the old-fashioned experience of seeing the person asking for their vote. So when the margins appeared, they were not a mathematical ambush. They followed the footprints. 60% on one side, 38% on the other. That does not mean Mundubile lacked national support. Clearly, he had millions of votes. Well, about 1 million. It means a campaign rooted heavily in old governing networks can deliver an impressive opposition result without achieving the geographic expansion necessary for a national majority. The Patriotic Front's decade in power left organizational memory. What it did not leave was a permanent title deed to Zambia. Hichilema understood something profoundly unromantic about elections. Democracy is sometimes just mileage. Go where you are popular, go where you are unpopular, go where somebody has already told you not to bother, then bother anyway. The candidate who treated the map as compulsory collected the larger national share. Eventually, campaign geography becomes arithmetic, and arithmetic has never accepted a press conference as a grounds for appeal. Let's talk about the night the counting stopped being the only story. The Electoral Commission announced the presidential result in the early hours of the 18th. Hichilema had roughly 60%, Mundubile had roughly 38%. The margin was enough to finish the presidential contest in one round. Cost of living pressures had clearly given the opposition something substantial to campaign on. Mundubile's numbers showed dissatisfaction existed and that old PF political networks remained very much alive. But dissatisfaction is not automatically a majority. Twitter may occasionally operate that way. Elections generally require numbers. The ballots settled that question. Then, almost immediately, Zambia acquired another question entirely. The national conversation moved from ballot boxes to a house in Kabulonga. Mundubile released a video describing an armed raid, forced entry, gunfire, people injured or missing, and himself hiding before eventually being pulled from where he had taken shelter. Mundubile said Mutotwe Kafwaya had been shot. His account presented the operation as an attempt on his life. Then security forces presented their version, and their version contained considerably more firearms. Authorities said the operation followed prior intelligence. Officers reported being fired upon and returning fire. They said high-grade weapons were recovered, including AK-47s and military version Uzis. 11 people were apprehended. Mutotwe Kafwaya, who had served as a minister under Edgar Lungu's Patriotic Front government, was sadly killed during the exchange. Police later confirmed his identity after his family viewed the body. Suddenly, this was no longer simply an opposition politician saying the government came for him. Authorities were saying they came because they were already investigating something much larger. Kabulonga had gone from residential suburb to national security headline with impressive efficiency. The government described suspected militia activity and possible treasonous preparation. Mundubile rejected that account. He denied the weapons claims and argued that firearms at the property were ordinary civilian weapons. He and his running mate subsequently moved to a secure location. And this is where analysis requires something politics finds terribly inconvenient: holding two ideas in your head simultaneously. Mundubile's allegation of an assassination attempt requires investigation. So do the government's allegations. But the physical details reported by authorities cannot simply disappear because they ruin their preferred storyline. AK-47s and military-style Uzis are not normally what estate agents mean when they advertise a property as fully furnished in Kabulonga. A former cabinet minister dying during an exchange of gunfire is not a footnote. 11 arrests are not punctuation. At some point, the inconvenient details become the actual story. Equally, serious allegations do not automatically establish the guilt of everybody present. That is what investigations and courts are for. The political background, however, does matter, but political genealogy is not a criminal conviction. Mundubile and many around his political project emerged from structures that governed Zambia for a decade. They are experienced political actors connected to a former governing establishment, not political tourists who accidentally wandered into national politics while looking for the airport. When authorities say high-grade weapons were recovered in that environment immediately after an election, the state is entitled to investigate it as a national security question. The government must prove what it alleges. Mundubile is entitled to contest it. The public is entitled to evidence. Revolutionary concept perhaps, but evidence remains surprisingly useful when deciding what actually happened. No publicly established evidence shows that Hichilema personally manufactured a weapons case to remove his political rival. What the official sequence contains is an intelligence-led operation, reported weapons recoveries, an exchange of gunfire, 11 arrests, and the death of a former minister. Those facts and allegations must remain properly separated. The ballots had already decided the election. Kabulonga introduced an entirely different national crisis. One account says the runner-up survived an attempt on his life. The other says security forces interrupted a serious threat involving restricted weapons and possible treasonous activity. Neither account becomes true simply because somebody says it confidently into a camera. Otherwise, television would have solved crime decades ago. The evidence must now do the heavy lifting. The election required counting votes. Kabulonga requires determining exactly what happened inside that house and why. And when we arrive at the international coverage, because apparently Zambia had not generated enough drama domestically, some reporting settles quickly into the familiar African election template. There's an incumbent, there is an opposition, there are restrictions, there is tension. Insert democracy paragraph here. The problem with templates is that reality develops the terrible habit of refusing to fit inside them. At points, coverage described the contest as though Hakainde Hichilema were facing Edgar Lungu. There was one relatively significant obstacle to that matchup. Edgar Lungu was dead. He was not campaigning. He was not on the ballot. He was not waiting for results. Unless Zambia had quietly introduced a supernatural constituency without informing the Electoral Commission, this should have narrowed the candidate list considerably. The dispute surrounding Lungu's burial influenced political emotions, but grief does not constitute candidate registration. Confusing the living presidential challenger with the deceased former president is not an obscure statistical mistake hidden in paragraph 17. You have lost the cast, and it becomes difficult to explain Zambia's election while remaining uncertain about, for example, who participated in Zambia's election. That confusion also obscured Mundubile's political lineage. He was frequently presented as though he were simply a generic new opposition figure challenging entrenched power. But his strongest organizational foundations came from the political family that governed Zambia from 2011 to 2021. The PF lost the presidency in 2021. It did not lose every organizer, relationship, voter grievance, and regional loyalty at precisely the same moment. Politics does not factory reset after an election. Those networks remained, and many became the reservoir from which Mundubile drew strength. That context helps explain why particular provinces remained competitive and why others did not. Presenting the election simply as incumbent versus opposition strips away the history that makes the numbers intelligible. Not every opposition is new. Sometimes yesterday's government becomes today's opposition wearing a different lanyard. Then there was the campaign itself. One candidate held more than 100 rallies and physically campaigned across every district. The other retained serious regional support but had a more restricted physical footprint. Those details matter because they explain the result. If one candidate campaigns nationally, while another remains strongest where inherited networks are strongest, the geographic voting pattern should not arrive like supernatural activity. Sometimes the sophisticated explanation really is one man went there and the other man did not. Then came Kabulonga, and once again, the temptation was to squeeze events immediately into the established narrative. Opposition politician plus security operation equals repression. Convenient equation. Unfortunately, somebody added AK-47s to the mathematics. Authorities reported restricted weapons. There was an exchange of fire. 11 people were arrested. A former minister was killed. The government said the operation followed intelligence concerning suspected militia activity and a security threat. Mundubile disputed that account. Those are not details to hurry past because the headline has already been written 20 years ago. They are the story. The correct journalistic response is not automatically to believe government. Governments should be questioned aggressively. But questioning government does not require automatically disbelieving every investigative claim because the alternative produces a cleaner narrative. Journalism is supposed to investigate competing claims, not choose its favorite one before breakfast. If authorities say AK-47s and military-style Uzis were recovered, demand the evidence. If Mundubile says those claims are false, ask him to account for what was present. If government alleges treasonous preparation, demand proof. If opposition alleges an assassination attempt, demand proof. Journalism is not supposed to select the most emotionally satisfying allegation. It is supposed to make everybody uncomfortable by asking them to substantiate theirs. Instead, parts of the external coverage appeared to approach Zambia with the story already assembled and then search for details willing to cooperate. Unfortunately, the details were badly behaved. The election produced a clear winner. Campaign geography helped explain why. Mundubile's support reflected old governing networks. Kabulonga produced serious security allegations, firearms arrests, and a fatality. Reality had apparently declined the invitation to follow the prepared script. And somewhere, amid all of this, some international reporting still struggled with the introductory question of which living human being Hichilema had actually defeated. If you cannot keep the candidates straight, perhaps approach the grand theory of Zambian democracy with slightly more humility. Start with the ballot paper, then proceed to geopolitics. Because beginning with assumptions produces reporting that gradually drifts away from the elections Zambians actually conducted. The numbers were clear, the political histories were available, the campaign schedules were visible. The Kabulonga allegations required examination from both directions. Zambia did not need outsiders to make the story more dramatic. It already had a decisive election, a powerful opposition rooted in former governing networks, and a deadly security operation and allegations of treason. Frankly, if that material still requires embellishment, the problem is probably not Zambia. So what remains when the slogans, allegations, commentary, and international templates are removed? First, the election. Hakainde Hichilema secured a second term with roughly 60%. His campaign treated every district as necessary. Southern Province remained his political fortress. Western and Northwestern also delivered strongly, but his wider advantage came from national presence. He traveled into areas where he was weaker and still collected some votes. Again, that sounds almost offensively simple. Candidate visits voters, some voters choose candidate. Candidate receives votes. Political science departments may require several additional diagrams, a symposium, and possibly a visiting professor, but that is essentially the mechanism. Brian Mundubile finished with roughly 38%, a substantial result built significantly around areas where Patriotic Front networks had historically been the strongest. Those structures had governed Zambia under Michael Sata and Edgar Lungu for 10 years. They provided organization, loyalty, experience, and I guess cadres. What they did not provide was enough national expansion. A previous governing network can remain formidable without remaining nationally dominant. Zambia demonstrated the difference. Then came the second part of the record. After the declaration, an operation at a Kabulonga property associated with Mundubile produced competing accounts of extraordinary seriousness. Mundubile described an attempt on his life. Authorities described an intelligence-led security operation. They reported recovering high-grade weapons, including AK-47s and military version Uzis. 11 people were arrested. Mutotwe Kafwaya, a former minister under the previous PF administration, was sadly killed during the exchange. Apparently, election week had decided that counting ballots alone was insufficient drama. Authorities linked the investigation to suspected militia activity and possible treasonous preparation. Mundubile denied the weapons allegations and challenged the official account. He also announced a court challenge to the election result. The legal petition and security investigation therefore belong to the next chapter. Neither should be decided by television commentary, but neither should be rewritten simply to make the politics tidier. There is no publicly established evidence that Hichilema personally fabricated a weapons case to silence his opponent. There are official claims concerning recovered firearms, arrests, and a fatal shooting that require scrutiny and due process. The government must establish its allegations. Mundubile must be allowed to contest them. Serious analysis means refusing to remove inconvenient information on behalf of either side, even when inconvenient information has the terrible manners to spoil a perfectly good narrative. And finally, there is the media record. Parts of the international coverage struggled with the political lineage of the opposition, the geographic differences between the campaigns, and remarkably, even the identity of Hichilema's actual opponent. That matters. If you begin with the wrong candidate, for example, misunderstand where the challenger's political machinery came from, overlook where each campaign physically traveled, and approach the security crisis with your conclusion already selected, you are not simplifying Zambia for an international audience. You are covering an entirely different election. The actual one was complicated enough. A president campaigned nationally and won roughly 60%. A challenger rooted substantiality in previous governing networks, retained formidable regional support, and took roughly 38%. Then a security operation produced weapons, allegations, arrests, and a death. Nobody needed to improve the screenplay. The opposition called Kabulonga political violence. The government called it national security. The courts will deal with the petition. Investigators will deal with the guns, the arrests, and the death. But the election itself has already answered one question rather clearly. Hakainde Hichilema went looking for votes across Zambia and found 60% of them. Mundubile inherited a formidable political machine, held its strongest ground, and found 38%. That is not a conspiracy, that is arithmetic. Everything after Kabulonga deserves evidence, scrutiny, and due process, not convenient conclusions. And everything written about this election should begin with the Zambia that actually voted, not the Zambia somebody needed for a headline. Because if your analysis requires ignoring the campaign, confusing the candidates, resurrecting a dead president, and stepping around AK-47s to preserve the narrative, you are no longer reporting the story. You're auditioning for fiction. Zambia already gave us the facts. The least we can do is have the courage to report them. We'll see how it all goes, but for now, I guess it's congratulations to Hakainde Hichilema for managing to get a second take. Good night.